Well, hello, my dear friends. How's it going? I'm Vættir, and today I come to you to have a brief and quick approach to the spiritual beings or entities in ancient Norse religion. This is actually a subject I have already talked about on a past video 3 years ago, a 1 hour long video on the supernatural entities of Norse spirituality, but people barely watch the first 2 minutes of a video. So I'll try to make it shorter, go directly to the subject and something a little bit more succinct and adding a little bit of extra information, of course. So, here we go, if you please. In the Old Norse religion, there were a variety of supernatural beings that were neither gods nor giants, but were related to nature and the domestic sphere, acting as protectors and providers of fertility, fecundity, and prosperity. As it is a religion based on a predominantly agricultural and livestock society, as well as still quite the animistic understanding, even though in constant mutation, especially by the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age, the emphasis is on the belief in spirits, entities. Let's call them the unseen populations that ensured successful harvests, the growth of herds, and the safety of the farm and family. These supernatural entities encompassed beings that manifested themselves in human or animal form, and I would rather call them unseen populations of beings rather than spirits, because indeed the terms that shall be addressed here throughout this video were terms not used as a synonym for soul. Now, several authors even comment on the difficulty of studying these beings, as some of them have very similar functions, to the point of having raised doubts regarding their identity. Were they different entities? Or the same entities but with different names? Were these name variations originating from regionalism or from different time periods? Although these questions do not have definitive answers, scholars noticed some central aspects in these beings. Some appeared as women, men, and others in the form of animals as well, whose gender was not identified. These entities were only visible in dreams, visions, omens, or by people who had some magical or spiritual sensitivity. These beings lived mainly in nature, inhabiting mountains, caves, waterfalls, forests, etc. But some lived at people's home or within the farmstead. Therefore, once again, this research aims to try to define some of these entities, and I will comment a little about their names, functions, and aspects. Some literary sources where you can consult information about these spirits have already been mentioned in previous videos. I will also leave at the end of this very video the bibliography that has helped me to compose this video, right? And I suggest you check out the description of this video for other videos I've made, especially focusing on each entity and also concepts and other themes. Therefore, regarding the ancient Norse belief systems, we have references to gods who would manifest themselves in various forms, being visible, invisible, anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, or hybrid, which would be associated with various aspects of nature, life, society, and culture. Therefore, the concept of the divine in pre-Christian animistic beliefs is quite varied, contrary to what we are more accustomed to through Abrahamic religions, mostly post-Roman conceptions, of course. So, we have the same, let's say, animist scheme in the pre-Christian belief systems of Scandinavia, and then consequently quite a few traces in medieval Iceland as well, which, despite these sources, the great majority of these sources being post-Christianization and in an Icelandic Christian society, it is where we have the preservation of several aspects of Norse beliefs, mythologies, and folklore, which to a certain extent, would somewhat still be active or remain active in the Nordic folklore until the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, regarding the gods, the information is more concrete, although full of contradictions, which is natural, not only due to Christianization and the incorporation of varied religious aspects, but also because animism itself is a way of relating to the other and not a coherent system of beliefs and practices, as this is the natural way spirituality develops when there is no limitation by dogmas. Animism forms a culture that is in itself the continuous transmission of thoughts that undergoes immense ruptures and reinventions, always with the aim of relating. But well, beyond the gods, we then have another part in relation to the supernatural entities of the Old Norse world, which is a much more abstract and widely vast set of information, including a diversity of supernatural beings such as spirits, entities of all sorts, monsters, heroes, fantastic creatures, etc. Here, it turns out to be a subject that is not only much broader, but also much more complex and with more contradictions, more concepts, and more variations, as it is a reality that has the tendency to move away from the concepts of the divine from the moment there is dogmatization and an attempt to form specific religious concepts where the divine ends up stagnating. Therefore, in the most popular belief systems and outside of dogmatization, several concepts are free from or to be in constant change and adaptation because they are part of the population's mundane reality. It is for these reasons that entities that are not understood as deities end up almost being in a separate category and also end up being as important or sometimes even more important than gods, as they are entities that people not only turn to, but they are also even afraid of at times, both feared and revered, as they are very present entities because they really reflect the lives and needs of the people who believe in them. They are beings associated with the daily needs or expectations of protection, food, provision, health, security, fertility, fecundity, even survival. Although there were gods who would also be associated with these needs, of course, people still wanted someone closer, and these spirits, entities, whites, ancestors, animals, and heroes lived among humanity, sharing their reality. Even though the gods in some narratives were among humankind, it was not the same thing. This comes from the belief in guardian and tutelary spirits or entities linked to the residence, the land, the rural property, the family, and the various conceptions of inheritance. Such characteristics gave these supernatural beings an intimate perception between themselves and people. This intimacy and closeness is essential. These are the entities that live closer to humanity in the natural landscape, and they cross boundaries of land and human settlement. They are just as present as any other animal that walks about, which is why I prefer to call them unseen populations, because this comes from the animistic understanding that the world is absolutely populated by persons. Not all of them are human. Entities of all sorts with whom we share space and existence with. But more about that on the videos concerning animism. This just to create an understanding, right, that such entities end up being far more important and present than deities in the lives of the general population, of course, because of this understanding of closeness and intimacy on a land that is shared by several persons of all sorts. I think it's really important to talk about this because the belief in tutelary spirits, but also in entities with which it is possible to create a symbiotic relationship with, came from the human being's need to have someone to turn to to help them in their life in a way nearest or closest to them. The gods and their powers were requested. Yes, indeed, of course they were. But depending on the religion, they were beings busy with their own lives and tasks. On the other hand, the tutelary spirits had functions exclusively linked to their families and the people they choose or have chosen to protect, practically existing to serve and guard them. And other entities would also be out there, in one way or another, linked to people's needs in indirect or direct ways, as beings linked to the fertility of the soils and of the animals, and even to the natural phenomenon, which directly would have no connection to protection and effective link with human beings, but whose powers and existence are related to things in the world that are necessary for human survival. And that is why humans build more direct connections with these entities in order to maintain a space of coexistence to guarantee survival. We notice that these relationships between humans and supernatural entities or the unseen populations present the need for people to have some magical, religious, divine, supernatural form to turn to. This, for example, can be seen in the belief in household snakes or domestic serpents that, in one way or another, exist to give something beneficial to the people who live in these spaces, in the house. Here we have a way of possessing a supernatural entity for human benefit and having to care for the well-being of that entity to maintain the benefits the entity can provide. By the way, believing that the residence or one's home could be guarded by a guardian spirit in the form of a serpent or a snake was not exclusive to medieval Scandinavians. So let's start with the Vættir and the Landvættir, the spirits of nature, already discussed here and elaborated further on in other videos. But I'll try to be brief. I just think that my introduction so far was necessary for a better understanding and insertion into this topic. Well, first of all, we'll start with the nomenclatures, which are not always easy to use. The ancient Nordic populations used the term Vættir to refer to spirits in general, which could include beings that, in our modern sense, would not be considered spirits as in souls or translucent shades, which would be beings such as elves and dwarves, in addition to the condition that in different studies it is not considered that the Dísir and the Fylgjur were Vættir, but rather other types of entities, and these two closer to something more within the conceptions of a spirit as projections of persons. It varies greatly, not only in the understanding of the habitat, the realm where various entities can inhabit, but also their interaction and expression in the world and their relationship with people, such as their own body existences as well, and where they manifest themselves. Well, the other category or subcategory were the Landvættir, the spirits associated with the earth, with the land itself. These being inhabitants of rocks, caves, hills, being associated with the fertility of the earth and with protection purposes. They can either have a more ethereal existence or they can have a more corporeal existence to the point of being visible or manifesting a visible presence in the world, contrary to most accounts of the Fylgjur, for instance, whose manifestations are far more present in dream or sleep states, which we shall talk about further ahead. Trying to catalog which spirit would belong to one of the two groups is not an easy task, as elves and dwarves appear included in both categories, depending on the author who wrote about them, but also on people's own beliefs and even their own existences. Personally, I find it pointless trying to insert them into categories, as we clearly see an animistic understanding very present here in the belief in entities that are seen as non-human persons, other than human and more than human persons. Already mentioned here in other videos about animism. So, their existence and interactions vary a lot, like any other being with its own identity and individuality. However, scholars try to highlight some possible variations, of course. The historian Rudolf Kaiser, one of the first to pay attention to this belief in protective spirits and nature spirits, considered that the Vættir and the Landvættir had a protective function, but this function would be associated with the place and region, different from the Dísir and the Fylgjur, which would be spirits that would individually protect people or families. Kaiser also pointed out that the concept of Landvættir was seen mainly among Icelanders and Norwegians. He comments on the case of the Fylgjur law, or Ulfjot, the first law speaker of Iceland from around 930 of the Common Era, which requested that the vessel figureheads with dragon or serpent heads be removed or covered before vessels docked in Iceland, so that those figures would not frighten the Landvættir, right? Other authors comment on this curious example, pointing out that the belief in these nature spirits was very important among Icelanders, to the point that they created a law to prevent them from being frightened and thus move away, and thus the very land losing its power. The literary sources themselves give us different understandings, of course. We have the example of elves, Álfar. They could be Landvættir, entities related to the soil and the fertility and protection of the land, both more physical in their presence and also more ethereal, but they could also be the ancestors of families who would go through a post-death transformation and became protective entities of the land, the family, and transmitted fertility and even luck. The Landvættir, according to Icelandic sagas, were associated with nature, inhabiting hills, mountains, rivers, rocks, granting protection and fertility. They could take the form of humans, giants, and even animals. They were known as shy beings, which is why they were rarely seen. How convenient. However, some appeared to humans, to human beings. The story of Álfar tells us that precisely he was helped by a Landvættir in hunting and fishing. The help was so good and so great that Björn's herd of goats grew immensely. The outlaw Greithir, on his journey, met a stranger who said that his daughter was seriously ill, but she was cured by a mysterious man who lived in a cave. The stranger told Greithir that he thought the man in the cave was a Landvættir. So some would have a more present, palpable effect, interaction, and even consequence. Other scholars point out some different interpretations to understand the Vættir and the Landvættir. Some comment that in written accounts there are the expressions Vættir, good spirits or good spirit, and Vættir, bad spirit. It is not clear that it could be a Christian influence, right? This notion between good and bad spirits or evil spirits, since with the advancement of Christianity in Iceland and Norway, missionaries and priests began to fight against the cult of these spirits, who would even receive offerings in the form of food. Clerics considered these creatures to be demons. Therefore, this division between good spirits and evil spirits could be perhaps an influence of Christian perception in an attempt to put an end to the cult or to these spirits. But on the other hand, in several animist beliefs, there is a notion of spirits that are not so beneficial like others and may even have a harmful nature, being entities more related to the wild and unpredictable aspects of nature. In fact, the sources indicated that the Vættir and the Landvættir may feel offended. As such, they could cause harm to humans, suspending their protection and blessings even, or even withholding help, and this could actually give rise to the use of the expression Vættir, evil spirits. However, I should say that some authors suggest an unusual dichotomy, pointing out that the Holla Vættir were associated with the bright gods and elves, while the Min Vættir were associated with giants, dwarves, and dark elves. However, this is something I disagree with, as these authors use the reference to elves as a classification presented by Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda, in which he clearly divides elves into benign beings associated with light and dark elves and dwarfs as evil beings associated with darkness. And Snorri was clearly creating a perception that was similar to his own Christian religious views, not only of himself but of his compatriots. Snorri's descriptions of fair elves from the sky is very much and quite clear a medieval description of angels. This notion of benign and malignant is not noticeable in sources before Snorri. Some authors agree that the Vættir were nature spirits different from other beings such as elves, dwarves, and fairies. The Vættir would inhabit natural places such as forests, waterfalls, and trees, receive offerings generally in the form of food, and could take on different forms. They were linked with fertility, prosperity, and protection. It is possible that the more recent sources may have confused these spirits with elves and even the Dísir, as such beings are also linked to nature and fertility, and could be associated with the cult of the ancestors. But we have a problem here. The case of the giants of Norse mythology, which are a variety of entities related to many different things, but for the most part related to nature and the most primordial, even chaotic aspects of nature, being thus in part also considered entities related to the natural world and not only inhabiting natural spaces, but they themselves being landscape features. Although giants have a much more unpredictable role, and unlike other entities, giants are beings with whom the gods purposely and actively interact with for a variety of reasons, much more than they interact with humans and other beings. But it is possible that giants may have been considered Landvættir, or that some of the characteristics of the Landvættir come from the conceptions of giants. After all, it's animism. As such, it is a continuous narrative that aims to relate with land and its persons. I think it is safe to say that Vættir has more than one meaning, as seen in literary accounts, but generally associated mostly with the idea of a protective spirit in some way, but which could also act in a perverse way if angered or offended. After all, literal translations of certain terms often destroy much of the meaning they have in the original language, because as time passes and the different cultural conceptions and belief systems tend to be added to already existing terms, further extending the meaning of those terms, right? There are stories that show the Vættir acting in an evil way, which indicates a difficulty in clearly defining the identity of these spirits as always being benign entities. This negative view may have existed both during the pagan and Christian periods, and if there really was this notion that such beings could act in less benign ways, perhaps it was a characteristic more pronounced by Christians in order to demonize the belief in these beings. The belief in Vættir was not limited to Iceland and Norway, but was seen in Denmark, Sweden, and the Faroe Islands as well. This belief persisted even with the Christianization of these territories, perpetuating itself in Scandinavian folklore, as beings like the Nisse, which were creatures inspired by the Vættir. By the way, regarding spirits and water entities from Nordic folklore, I have, and I will leave for you 5 videos on the topic in the description of this video. So please take a look if you have the patience and the time, of course. But there appears to have actually been a category of Vættir and its subcategory of Landvættir. The latter would be nature spirits that would live in mountains, hills, rivers, fields, forests, trees, rocks, among other places. They would resemble the guardian spirits seen among other cultures, as in the case of the Anglo-Saxons with their stories about the Cuculati, with their origins, of course, in Romano-Briton beliefs. The Jinni Cuculati, the hooded spirits, also called the hooded or cloaked ones, due to wearing capes and hoods. These beings were associated with fertility, prosperity, and protection, and would live in nature. Even other beings found in Scotland and Ireland also had similarities with the Nordic Landvættir. They had the ability to take on other forms and help people. And not coincidentally, we see here similarities with the Same Seidi, usually an unusual rock formation or a prominent landscape feature, as sacred sites on which offerings, rituals, and sacrifices were performed for such unusual or special landscape formations and phenomenon that are a sign or understood as a sign of the presence of powerful entities and even the home of such entities. The Sami Stalo, for instance, giant human-like creatures of the land. So now let's talk about the Dísir, spirits of fertility. The Dísir, Dís in the singular form, are mysterious female spirits associated with fertility and protection, and according to some authors, they would be associated with the Vanir gods due to this fertility reference, right? Although there is really no concrete evidence of this connection, and it is often quite easy to associate some entities, even gods and other spirits or entities, with the Vanir gods when there is some characteristic of fertility and or magic. But this is not always the case, and in fact the only concrete information we have about the Vanir gods is that they were just the 3 deities. Sorry. However, it should be mentioned that the goddess Freyja is also called Vanadis, literally the Dis of the Vanir. But it's unlikely that this is a reference to the Dísir as being entities of the Vanir, but rather Freyja herself as being one of the entities that also enters the group of the Dísir, because, as we shall see further ahead, the Dísir were feminine beings associated with fertility, protection, destiny, and death. So it makes sense. It was a type of cult towards a group of entities under these characteristics, rather than separate displays of ritual towards each individual entity. Sorry again. Now, some older studies attempt to identify the Dísir as minor goddesses with unknown names, but who would be associated with nature, the fields, and the protection of the home. Well, it's a possibility, really, although they don't seem to have been just or only deities, but rather a vast array of female entities. We know that the Dísir would receive worship through banquets and sacrifices, more specifically in the sacrificial ceremony of Dísablot, both in private and public spaces, as a way of symbolizing the prosperity attributed to them. We know little about this cult, mind you. It may have been a cult to these entities that was more linked to the well-being of the family than to agrarian rights. Furthermore, it was a widespread cult in some regions of Scandinavia due to the typonymy presenting the name Dis, which would suggest that these were places where these spiritual entities were worshipped. In fact, some authors argue that these goddesses or spirits having a female or feminine form was a representation of the condition of women's role in Scandinavian society as guardians of the home. Although this is a perception that is already quite outdated, as stated in previous videos, stereotypes regarding women during Victorian society had a great influence on the distortion of history in relation to the perception of the feminine and the role of women in past societies. There is nothing concrete that tells us why the Dísir are only female spirits and what the purpose of the cult really is or was, or still is. We only know that they were actually worshipped, mostly during the celebration of Dísablot. Not all of these entities would be goddesses, as previously believed, and it is very likely that this group would include the Hamingjur and Fylgjur, probably the Valkyriur as well, the Valkyries, and also ancestral manifestations of women. A curious fact, with the exception of elves, the other spirits here mentioned have in common the fact that they are referred to most of the time as being female. Although the Fylgjur could take other forms, of course, namely of animals, but there is generally a huge set of female spiritual entities in pre-Christian Nordic beliefs. As I said, the Dísir were female spirits who received a very specific cult, and it seems to have been only seasonal, this so-called Dísablot celebration, which occurred in winter, on the so-called winter nights. The worship did not always involve the consumption of drinks or was held mainly within the home. There has long been this tendency on the part of some authors to refer to these pagan cults as something that always involved drinking, as if it were an excuse to get drunk. But also this tendency to refer to these cults as something restricted within the familiar space only, in contrast to the collective celebrations of Christianity. In fact, from the few references we have about Dísablot, it was also a public celebration for everyone to see. Some reports suggest an external cult, right? Therefore, public and not private, out in the open, which would involve sacrifices on an altar. Something commented on this the saga of Hervor, and in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, and in the saga of Vigao Glooms, among other reports, especially reports in which it involves a male figure of nobility riding a white horse around the hall or the temple, calling the Dísir, therefore a public performance. I've said worship, but it's not likely that it was worship in the most current sense of the word, as in veneration, but more of a cultic performance to call upon auxiliary spirits. Cult, as in a ritualistic/celebratory performance to summon the presence of entities for some beneficial aspect, and not to present devotion. This cult of the Dísir would be done to invoke these feminine spirits, especially in winter. Although the Dísir were also mentioned at other times of the year and even appeared in dreams as an omen, which causes them to be confused with the Fylgjur, which are also said to appear in dreams. But many female entities appear in people's dreams. Not all of them benevolent, mind you, and this is evident not only in the pre-Christian belief systems of the ancient Nordic world, but but also throughout the European folklore. There's actually a standing and well-formed pattern of feminine entities connected to fate and destiny and appearing in people's dreams. There has been debate regarding the term Dís. It has been suggested that the word Dís may have been an invention by poets to refer to the Fylgja. On the other hand, it has been suggested sometimes the same authors who suggested that it was a poetic invention, contradicting themselves by saying that it was not, after all, a poetic invention, and that the word Dís could be original term from somewhere in Scandinavia to refer to the Fylgja, right? These are valid suggestions, since the distinction between the functions of the Dísir and the Fylgjur are almost non-existent, as the existing differences are found in the condition that there is no mention of the Fylgjur receiving worship or cult or sacrifice or any form of cult, and that they would transform into animals as well, something not seen with the Dísir that would present themselves in human form. However, Fylgjur seem to fall more within the field of familiar spirits or auxiliary spirits often having similarities precisely with auxiliary spirits and even being mind emissaries and magical projections of shamans as a general word or term just for a better understanding within the belief systems of circumpolar regions. That's the major difference between the Fylgjur and the Dísir, which helps us to understand them as different types of entities. As the Fylgjur seem to have been specific spiritual entities of an individual person and no cult mentioned to them, whilst the Dísir were collective feminine entities existing as independent, autonomous and self-governed entities that were not part of the human personal spiritual experience, but rather called upon in specific celebrations for a collective beneficial effect. Since the Dísir seem to have really been a large group of female entities, as was said before, it is possible that this group included the Fylgjur, the Valkyries, female spirits normally associated with destiny and death. From this perspective, it is possible that the Dísir would be a group of entities associated with death or the earth or both, as they are associated with rites generally celebrated during winter with the aim of invoking protection and prosperity for those difficult seasonal time periods in which, from a more animistic perspective, the clear, drastic and dramatic change in the landscape provokes an understanding of the abandonment of the spirits responsible for the fertility of the soils and the forces of nature that provide fertility, thus living a desolate scenario where death reigns due to the scarcity of food resources. Therefore, the Dísablót was carried out in homes or outdoors, or both, in places demarcated with altars, dísasal, or other such indicators to call upon entities that can provide something beneficial in times when human beings could no longer rely on other spirit entities which were part of the symbiotic relationships within agrarian societies. And as I said, the Dísir would be associated with omens. We have the terms, for example, spodis, seer. Therefore, these entities as being seers, soothsayers, linked to the knowledge of the destiny and of the future. This may have either been a reference to feminine spirits of once human women who, while in life, had been connected to soothsaying, oracles, prophetesses, augury work of some sort, and upon death they entered the group of the Dísir, or the term spodis was indeed given to living seeresses and prophetesses, precisely as a reference to women linked to the arts of foretelling the future, and in this way the term Dís is indeed in reference to gender attribution. It's it's perfectly understandable why there are so many contradictions and also confusion as to the nature of the Dísir and why they are often compared to the Fylgjur. We are talking about centuries worth of literary sources from the late Scandinavian Iron Age to the Icelandic Middle Ages, from skaldic poetry to Icelandic sagas. Content, conceptions, ideas, beliefs that have changed over the centuries and overlapped each other, regional systems of belief, and in later sources there's also a clear attempt from Nordic medieval writers to somewhat try to understand all these beliefs from their own past by transforming the myths and folklore into something that could be more comprehensive for themselves under their own social and religious reality of the time. The Dísir are frequently mentioned in Old Norse prose literature, mostly as fetch-like women appearing in dreams, so kind of like the Fylgjur and even the Hamingjur, of which we will speak of further ahead, presenting themselves in dreams as omens. But then over time there are many changes, contradictions, elements that are added, elements that are taken out due to the several social, religious and political changes in the Nordic world. For instance, Several Eddic sources kind of give us the idea that many of the Dísir might have indeed been Valkyries, or some form of Valkyrie-like guardian entities of the dead, as some sources indicate that the Valkyries are Odin's Dísir. This could either be a reference as feminine entities linked to death and fate, particularly related to the god Odin, or that Odin's Valkyries are Dísir, in the sense of stating both their gender and attributes. Both are just as likely. It became more confusing, actually, or it becomes more confusing as to their nature, when in the particular poem Outlamol, Dísir are explicitly called dead women, very much in the sense of Fylgjur, which not only gives us the impression that it was a group of feminine entities of all sorts, including ancestral human women, and linked to the Fylgjur as a merging of conceptions and beliefs. And there's of course the Dísir, literally the Dísir of the land, as feminine spirits of the land in Icelandic folklore. In addition to this, the Old Norse word dis also appears simply as a term for woman. It is rather problematic, as you can see, to draw a conclusion, as dis and Dísir could easily simply mean woman and women respectively. Only that what seems we can really say for sure is that we are in the presence of feminine entities of all sorts which were called upon collectively. The term Dísir could simply mean all women, all feminine, all the female supernatural entities as a general term, but separately, according to each role, they were called other types of Dísir, not a subcategory or subcategories, but specifying their conditions and roles and characteristics, such as Land Dísir, the feminine entities of the land, or Spo Dísir, the particular women involved in divination and augury, the Dísir of Odin as a kinning for Valkyries, Vanadis as a kinning for Freyja, woman of the Vanir, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that the actual role of the Dísir cannot be clearly defined. Not even the moments of sacrifice to them can give us conclusive information. I would say their cult is far more similar to that of the matrons throughout the Roman Empire and other areas that have adopted such a cult, a broader approach to feminine entities whose roles and functions were extremely varied, from fertility to protection, magic, divination, augury, death, guardianship, war, etc. A focus on the feminine entities brought together on specific seasonal cults to include the many blessings, purposes, and effects of several different feminine entities. Traces of the cult are also observed in Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and the Orkney Islands. And even outside the Scandinavian world, there are many similarities in cults that include the general feminine without great specifications, but including all types of supernatural feminine entities. This subplot, depending on the toponymy, we understand that it would be more important in some specific locations. And in general, the subplot in the home, in the household, would be done specifically to ask for the protection of that family, but the public cult should be celebrated to ask for the protection and well-being of the community, as in the sagas, for example, there are mentions of kings participating on the subplot. In the Old Norse culture, kings also had a religious role, which included presiding over and directing rituals and representing the protection of the kingdom, including being blamed for the problems such as lack of rain, plagues, and harsh winters. Therefore, it would be in the interest of monarchs and other members of the nobility to administer cults to stay alive by freeing themselves from the guilt of something bad happening. Here, the cult of certain entities is fundamental in an agrarian society that still has very strong animistic notions, in which the key to survival lies in the symbiotic relationships between the human community and the various beings and supernatural entities that inhabit the landscape and that have strength and influence over everything that happens in the world. In this sense, soil fertility is essential for survival, which is why the Dísir are called as feminine entities of all types, which encompass several different characteristics and powers, being called to act and guarantee the continued well-being of the community. It was in the interest of the nobility to preside over the cults, as I was saying, to show that the effort is being made to maintain a healthy relationship with entities that can provide beneficial things for the community, thus showing that if there is a problem, it is not due to the lack of worship, nor is it due to lack of attention and effort to maintain this relationship between human communities and the community or the communities of the unseen persons, of the unseen populations. Therefore, identifying the Dísir is difficult. As already said, the word Dís could mean woman, female, lady, which opens up a wide range of interpretations, allowing goddesses and other spirits to be included in the context, even human women. Without a doubt, the word Dís has had its meaning changed over time, ceasing to be a common word to refer to woman, to being used to refer to female deities of undefined identity, ancestral women, feminine spirits of all aspects, even the Norns as entities linked to destiny. That's why there are narratives that the Dísir are similar to the Fylgjur and even the Hamingjur, to warn of danger or to show future events. It's not strange at all. Even to the Valkyries, when they appear on the person's deathbed, or appear as spirits that can get in the way, causing the person to get hurt, as in this case of some of the Fylgjur that are not beneficial, even giving rise to the figure of the Mara in Scandinavian folklore, which appears in other European folklores as well, as a female entity that causes nightmares and attacks people, causing them discomfort, and even cursing people, riding them in dreams, literally the nightmare. Okay, now relocating because I really don't like the sun and it hurts my pretty ghostly pale face. Anyway, let's talk about the... Where were we actually? Sorry. Yes. So let's now talk about the Fylgjur, protective spirits, a topic that I have already talked about here many times before in several videos, but I will now add a few more points, a little bit more information. As previously mentioned, there are similarities between the Dísir and the Fylgjur, and I would like to express here what these similarities were. While the word Dís is suggested to mean woman, the word Fylgja is translated as the one who follows or companion, fetch, right? This condition is due to the fact that the belief in these protective spirits points out that each human being would have a particular Fylgja which would accompany the person from birth to death. This condition is reminiscent of the idea of guardian angel in Catholicism, or the idea of daemon among the ancient Greeks, or of the personal animal spirit or tutelary spirit seen among some people and cultures with shamanic characteristics, as well as the fetch or familiar spirit in traditional folk magic. The Fylgja was generally described as having the form of a young woman, and she was invisible to her word, to the person she was the guardian of. With the exception of people gifted with magical or spiritual gifts who could see these spirits, the majority of the population did not see them. The Fylgjur could appear in dreams, being called draumakona, dream woman, or they could appear through visions or in the imminent death of their protege, characteristics shared by the Dísir according to some reports. Beliefs said that when a person saw their Fylgja, it meant that they were in danger or close to death. Thus, seeing one's own Fylgja was a bad omen. In addition to each person having their own Fylgja, there were Fylgjur who protected entire families, these being called Fylgja or Kynfylgja. According to the account of some sagas, these family Fylgjur passed from generation to generation because when a person died, their Fylgja left with the person, but the family Fylgja remained as long as the family continued to exist. Due to this specific approach to the family, this type of Fylgja is confused with the role of the Dísir, as previously mentioned, of course, right? Especially given the possibility of them being ancestral entities of a family, which might indicate that indeed some of the Dísir were people's Fylgjur. As such, the Dísir were indeed every feminine, spiritual and supernatural entity. However, the big difference between the Fylgjur and the Dísir is due to two factors. The first, because the Fylgjur can take the form of animals, and the second, because the Fylgjur do not receive worship. In several sagas, there are mentions of the presence of Fylgjur in animal form, generally appearing in dreams to warn of dangers or the approaching death of the protected person. The animal form varied in these narratives. There are Fylgjur in the form of bear, fox, wolf, bull, and eagle. Possibly animals that would have a symbolic value in the context of the narrative, something that should indeed be analyzed to understand these conceptions, because we may not only be among or exclusive a pagan understanding only, but rather various religious conceptions, including Catholic ones, depending on the narrative and what the information in the narrative, the information provided, wants to pass, right? I say this because the bull and the eagle are not very common animals in a Nordic pre-Christian context, and the eagle in particular, although there is a brief mention in Norse mythology about the eagle at the top of Yggdrasil, it was a conception brought by the Romans, or brought by Roman influence, and later developed with Christianity. But the animal manifestation of the Fylgjur could not only alert the protege about coming threats, but they could alert family members as well. For example, the case of the Eddic poem Atlamol, singing or the Song of Atli, in which Kosbera dreamed of her Fylgja in the form of an eagle, but the spirit announced that the danger would not be with her, but with her husband, Hogni. Some Fylgjur take the form of various animals, such as wolves, bears, ravens, eagles, swans, pigeons, bees, flies, and snakes. Certainly some of these animals are actually a reflection of a strong animistic and shamanic influence in the Old Norse religion. The swan in particular is something that we see quite early in the Iron Age, already in funerary monuments on the island of Gotland, usually related to the Valkyries, being a conception that persists and continues on even in later times in medieval Icelandic narratives. In sagas and poems, it was more common for the Fylgjur to appear in animal form, this form being called Fylgja, or by other names, of course. The animal form would not only have a symbolic character associated with the interpretation of dreams, but could be the personification of the person's character or social status. In general, the stories that narrated the presence of Fylgjur in the form of a bear, wolf, bull, and eagle refer to chieftains or warriors, and even belonging to a noble lineage with some connections with royalty, and these animals are related with such social and religious aspects. The eagle personifies nobility and authority, the bull expresses bravery and strength, bears and wolves also represent strength, courage, authority, and so on and so forth. These characteristics were highly valued in the Nordic society of the past for a chieftain and a warrior and even for a king. Some forms of animals or animal forms in these fylgjur are very curious, such as the lion and the leopard, animals that do not exist in Scandinavia. These are probably late narratives influenced by symbolic elements from the south of the continent, which would explain the presence of these two animals that are strange to the Nordic fauna and overall to the European fauna. As I said before, we are faced with narratives that demonstrate symbolisms that are part of a great influence of different cultures, religions, and concepts over a very long period of time in which various peoples interacted with each other. Still, the lion and the leopard would follow the same symbolism associated with nobility, authority, virtue, strength, and courage, something that was looked for in chieftains and warriors and kings and so on and so forth. Although the fylgja is a kind of spirit of a person, it does not present so much that idea as if it were a person's totemic animal, right? But rather an individual entity which, in female human form, would have its own thoughts independent of the consciousness of its protege. However, the animal fylgja would be a spiritual manifestation of its protege. Therefore, we see here different concepts that are integrated and expressed in the figure of the fylgja. There might have been indeed a certain, let's say, totemic understanding of the fylgjur in some of its origins, although that's something hard to perceive from the evidences we have. Besides, there's a very basic and shallow understanding of totemism, unfortunately, which, from an animistic understanding, is far more complex than just a person's spirit animal. That complexity is not noticed in the Old Norse and Icelandic sources, but may have once existed in the most primordial conceptions of the fylgjur. Once again, there is a marked complexity in understanding the fylgjur due to the various terms used to refer to these spirits. Among these name variations, there are manfylgja, man's fylgja or personal fylgja. The feminine form was also called ofridla fylgjur, fylgjur agitated, or ovidna fylgjur, fylgjur adversaries. These two examples referring to stories where fylgjur attacked the enemies of their proteges in order to protect them. The family fylgjur were called edafylgja and kynfylgja, as mentioned previously. Those that appear in dreams were called draumakoda. Those that announced the upcoming death were called daurafylgja, death companions of sorts, almost like the Grim Reaper. Those who presented clairvoyance were called spodis, as previously mentioned, which led them to being confused with the Dísir. The different terms or subgenres of the fylgjur may also be a reflection of regional variations or inventions of poets and writers. It gets to a point where it is very difficult to really determine the origins of these things due to there being a large set of conceptions and belief systems. There you go. The Dísir could be another name for the fylgjur, just as the fylgjur could be part of the Dísir as being feminine beings that enter the collective group of the supernatural and spiritual feminine. But mind you, that I'm here today only dealing with the subject from an academic perspective in relation to the sources and evidences that we have, and not dealing with unverified personal gnosis and people's own experiences in relation to the spiritual. I'm sure many of you have their own spiritual experiences, which, as you know, I don't mind at all knowing all about them. So if you would be so kind, please write about it in the comments below, if you want, of course. Now, talking about the Hamingjur, spirits of luck, not just the personification of luck, what is curious is that in this perception is that luck is not merely random in ancient Norse beliefs, but a force existing in the world that can be somewhat manipulated and has its own identity, being a set of spiritual entities. Something I've talked about here before and in more depth on another video. In this video today, however, I'm going to summarize a lot, I'll try to, because the video is already getting quite long. My apologies. However, regarding the Hamingjur, Hamingja in the singular form, female spirits of luck, some authors argue that they would not be different types of spirits, but another name to refer to the Fylgjur. However, reading the sources, obviously, there are clear perspectives that the Hamingja is different from the Fylgja, with the former being associated with luck and the latter with protection. The Hamingja would be the personification of good luck and could even be passed on from one individual to another, as in the Nordic perception, luck would be a spirit, a kind of spirit, that would accompany the person. Although it is not known exactly how this exchange could be made, in any case, we understand that the Fylgja was not transferred except the family Fylgja, but the Hamingja, however, could be transferred from person to person, namely giving someone's name and some physical object belonging to that person to another person, thus passing on the characteristics of a person, including their luck and their power, their Hamingja, onto the other person that would bear the name or part of the name of the former owner of the Hamingja. Something, again, that has already been said here before in relation to the perception of reincarnation in ancient Scandinavian and medieval Icelandic literature. However, the Hamingjur could be confused with the Norns, as they are spirits of destiny and also associated in some cases with luck. We will now talk about the elves, beings with different identities. As for the elves, Álfar, they also have problems of interpretation and identification. While cinema, drawings, illustrations, comics, and video games perpetuated the image of elves being small beings like gnomes or little elven creatures, or sometimes having human appearance, having a slender and noble bearing, quite tall, having long hair, light eyes, and pointed ears, elves in Scandinavian mythology and folklore, they did not have a defined appearance. In fact, the first illustration of a kind of an elf or gnome appears to us in the 16th century, to be more precise, the Tomte, as being from Norwegian and Swedish folklore, of small size, which appears on the night of the winter solstice to help farmers. But that's a subject for another time. Regarding elves, the Norse word Álfar, elf, has an etymological parallel with the Old English word elf or ilf. Both words date back to the Proto-Germanic albus, which has parallels, of course, with the Latin albus, which means white. Due to this etymology, it is very likely that Snorre may have used it to create his two races of elves, designating between light and dark elves. I've already made a video about the various types of elves, mostly late conceptions in an Icelandic medieval context and more elaborated by Snorre Sturluson, in which he clearly draws a parallel between light elves and the conception of angels in Christianity during the Renaissance. But more information about this in that other video. Now, in the Norse context, elves appear to belong only to the male gender, although in later Icelandic sources from the late Middle Ages, the word Álfkona, she-elf, appears. Possibly an English influence at that time, as in the English language there was a feminine word for elf. However, this word seems to have been unusual even in Scandinavian folklore. Dwarves are also all male in this context, as there are no mentions of female dwarves in Norse myths. However, in Anglo-Saxon mythology, there were elves, elf or ilf, and she-elves, ilfen. The condition of the Norse elves being only male would already differentiate them from the Dísir, Fylgjur, and the Hamingjur, as these are represented essentially as women, as feminine, right? Some authors suggest that the word elf in the Norse context could have different interpretations. For example, in the Poetic Edda, the elves could be some kind of minor deity whose names have been lost in oral tradition, or even a reference to the Vanir, which would place them close to the fertility and prosperity rites of these gods, which by in turn, it would justify the Álfar sacrifice to the elves. On the other hand, in the prose Edda, elves appear as two distinct races, inhabiting two different worlds or realms, but without importance in the myths. In the sagas, elves are represented as spirits of nature, whose functions confuse them with the Dísir and the Vættir. They also receive offerings to provide fertility and protection, and would be associated with the cult of the dead. In skaldic poetry, the word elf appears as a noun used for metaphors, kenningar, or for masculine nicknames. By the way, I already made a video about the Álfar celebration, a more recent one with more information and bibliography, where I talk about this issue of elves also being associated with the cult of the dead, of the ancestors, let's say, as some elves would have been humans who, in the process of death, go through a transformation, becoming elves as spiritual entities of the earth linked to the fertility of the soil, which in turn I talk about in more detail in an older video precisely about the cult of death and the dead in the Old Norse religion. I will put all these links in the description of this video, don't worry. Continuing, in some Eddic poems such as the Voluspo and the Lokasenna, elves are mentioned as beings that are in the company of the gods, right? However, they do not have a defined appearance, nor do they have their own names mentioned, unlike the dwarves, who have several names mentioned in the Voluspo. In the poem Volundarkvida, the hero Volund is visited by an elf named Dane. However, Dane is a name associated with dwarves. In the Poetic Edda, it is not said where the elves would live. However, in the prose Edda, Snorre mentions that there were two races of elves, the luminous or light elves, Ljósálfar, and the dark elves, Svartálfar, or also dark or black elves, Dökálfar. The light elves would live in Alfheim, land of the elves or realm of the elves, and the dark elves would live in Svartálfheim, the land or the realm of the dark elves. The name of the dark or black elves would be, according to some interpretations, due to them living underground or far from sunlight, which Snorre purposely makes this contrast between the dark and the light, with the light elves living in the sky as well. Snorre elaborates much more on this issue of the elves, providing information that is not found anywhere else. Although Snorre Sturluson presented this variation among elves, it does not influence the mythological account at all, and it is not noticeable that it influenced other myths and narratives, as elves are not referred to by this difference, as Snorre has put it. However, elves were eventually confused with dwarves as well, which suggests that the Svartálfar may have emerged from this confusion, as dwarves used to inhabit caves, were blacksmiths, craftsmen, and knew magic as well, characteristics associated with elves as well. However, the main difference between elves and dwarves was that elves received worship or a cultic performance called Álfar. Regarding the sizes of the elves and dwarves, we don't know what size they would be. It is never mentioned in the Old Norse and Icelandic sources. The account of an Icelandic poet named Sigurðr Þórðarson, who visited the province of Västergötland in Sweden in the year 1017 or 1018, who reported having witnessed a cult to the elves being held in a house. It is important to note that in that year, Sweden was already largely influenced by Christianity, yet pagan practices continued to be carried out. This cult of elves is mentioned in other narratives, although with few details of how it occurred. Elves are also portrayed in different ways in the Eddas and sagas. In the legendary sagas, elves are associated with magic. In the sagas of kings, they are associated with some monarchs, including involving worship of the dead. In the Eddas, they are mentioned briefly and without importance in the narrative. Elves were also associated with dwarves, as we have dwarves called Álfar, Vindálfr, and Gandalf. This created confusion between the two beings. It is quite likely that the classification of light elves and dark elves may have been invented by Snorre Sturluson alone. Elves could be a category of spiritual beings, not a race, or it could be another name to refer to nature spirits, as in some sagas elves are associated with forests, mountains, and caves, which brings them closer to the Vættir and Landvættir, and such a condition was maintained in Nordic folklore. For example, in regions of Norway and Sweden, but also in Iceland, elves are called heathen people, hudefolk. Contrary to what it may seem, although elves in general, this conception already existed in pre-Christian times, much of the imagery about elves was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries with fairy tales, creating different images for these beings which do not correspond to the perception that the Nordic people of the Viking Age and the early and high Middle Ages would have of them, of the elves. Elves were creatures associated with nature, finding parallels with other spirits of Old Norse mythology and religion, in addition to having similarities to other beings seen in the cultures of Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Scottish, and Irish panorama. In the 19th century, Jacob Grimm, in his folklore studies, suggested the hypothesis that elves were ancient genii locos, guardian spirits of certain places, which would make sense since elves received worship or cult and offerings, right? However, Grimm highlighted that the division suggested by Snorre between light elves and dark elves could be influenced by Christian references based on angels and demons, associating light elves with good and dark elves with evil and the dead. And in this aspect, it really seems that he was right, because reading carefully what Snorri described about the elves, we are closer to Christian conceptions than to pagan ones, as we have sources of comparison between different perceptions about Snorri's elves and the other elves of Eddic, Skaldic poetry and many sagas as well. In addition to the comparison and confusion of elves with dwarves, elves could also be associated with the dead, such as the draugr, undead, or more appropriately, I think, reanimated corpse. The dark elves, who were described as living underground and having dark skin, could perhaps be a reference to the dead. Furthermore, in Anglo-Saxon literature, terms related to elves were much more varied than in Scandinavian literature. In the Anglo-Saxon case, there were reports of elves living in different places in nature, which reminds us of the nymphs of Greek mythology or the Vættir themselves of Norse mythology. We have examples of people adopting the word elf to form proper names, as elves were associated with intelligence and beauty. And there were stories of mischievous elves as well. Now, about the celebration of the Álfar, in the saga of Cormac, the sorceress Thordis recommends that Thorvard, who had been defeated and injured in a duel against Cormac, so that he could heal quickly and have better luck in the next fight, should steal one oxen from his enemy, take the animal to a hill where the elves lived and sacrificed the animal there, offering the blood and flesh to those spirits so that they would give him health and protection. Something similar is mentioned in Kristni saga, the saga of the conversion of the Icelanders, where an English bishop named Frederick, to convert the family of the Icelandic warrior Thorvaldur Kodarsson, who had already been baptized, the bishop destroyed a rock where a being called Hormaður lived, who granted protection and blessings to the family and lands in that place. Thorvaldur's father only agreed to convert to Christianity after the bishop Frederick expelled the Hormaður. This story of the Hormaður is reminiscent of the elf in the saga of Cormac, although the Landvættir in their functions were beings very similar to the elves. However, the Álfablót may also have been in some regions celebrated during winter, which confuses it with the Dísablót. Furthermore, we have cases of kings who had their names linked to elves and received worship. Kings Volund, the elf Olaf Álfar, and Álfr were associated with the cult of the elves. For instance, after his death, King Olaf received the epithet Álfr, the elf of Greistada, and began receiving worship and offerings in his tomb, where the population asked for good harvests and protection. Something previously mentioned in other videos about this issue, that this king's reign was so prosperous, so good, so peaceful, that after his own death, his body was venerated in the various places where various parts of his body were deposited, so that there would continue to be prosperity and fertility in those locations. A daughter of King Álfr, who was said to live in eastern Norway, performed the Dísablót in a place called Álfhildur, this place being associated with the elves. Due to such comments, elves are confused with other Vættir and dwarves, in addition to being associated with nature, protection rights, and also fertility, which made them connected with the Vanir gods in some way. Furthermore, their connection to kings who receive worship suggests a possible association with the cult of ancestors, although this is conjecture based on short reports contained in the sagas, as in the Eddas the function, identity, and the importance of elves are not revealed. Although there are parallels between the god Freyr, god of fertility and prosperity and sexuality, being also the king of the elves and being linked to the cult of the dead, more specifically to offerings deposited in burial mounds, which creates a parallel with the sources that tell us about the cult to certain dead people and to the elves who live in the places where they are buried. Whew. Good gods, are you still there? I did not expect this video to be this long, but some things have to be said. Anyway, all right, let's end this video with the Norns. This is my notebook, by the way. There is certainly a lot that we can talk about concerning the Norns, and I think they deserve a video just for them. And of course, I would once again have to talk about the Dísir and other feminine spiritual beings, etc., etc. But I'll summarize quickly, just focusing on the theme of this video. The Norns, the spiritual entities of destiny. As with elves, literary sources present different interpretations for these beings, for these entities, and the same is true for the Norns. In the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson wrote that the Norns were three sisters named Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, and they were the goddesses of destiny. And they would live near the Hurdarbrunner well, the well of Hurdarbrunn, right? In front of one of the three great roots of Yggdrasil. The number 3 and the number 9, among other multiples of 3, are a very important symbolic numerology in various religions, cultures, and belief systems. Of course, something that has already been discussed here on this channel on another video concerning the Old Norse belief systems. However, in other passages of this Edda, Snorri says that there would be other Norns, which he did not name them, and these would be associated with both good and bad fate. The idea that there would be more than 3 Norns was already considered in other poems compiled in the Poetic Edda, which did not necessarily limit such beings as 3 in number. Reading the sources, there would be at least 2 known versions about the Norns. The version that there would be several of them, and the version of the Prose Edda specifically, where it also says that there would be others, but only 3 are highlighted. This focus that Snorri gave to Hurd, Verdandi and Skuld could be an influence of the Greco-Roman belief in the Parcae or the Morai, which were, in both cases we had 3 sisters as well associated with destiny, right? We are not really talking about an influence between pagan cultures, but rather classical literature compiled, written and rewritten by Christianity using pagan models, and a great focus on classicism in the Renaissance, which will influence much of medieval European literature, an influence that we see quite a lot, quite clearly registered by Snorri. Anyway, the names of the Norns Hurd, past, Verdandi, present, and Skuld, future, would not necessarily have this temporal connection and could even be a later invention, as the word Verdandi is a variation of the same verb that originates Hurd. And in this case, the name of the Norn Hurd has been mentioned since the 10th century, being the oldest known. Such entities would be associated with the destiny and luck of people, but also with the idea of judgment, domr, and verdict, fitr. It is likely that at some point in pre-Christian Scandinavia, they were treated or understood as goddesses, as mentioned by Snorri. However, due to the great lack of information, the most sensible thing is to understand them as female spirits associated with the destiny and birth. The poem Fafnir Small, where there is mention of Norns as being spirits that will receive children and set their fate when they are born, they set their destinies to them. In this case, the dragon Fafnir tells Sigurd that there would be Norns in the service of the gods, dwarves, and elves, although it is not known for sure what this means or what this meant at the time. It may actually be a matter of various Norns as entities of destiny for different groups of beings. Other sources also point out that there would be several Norns, indeed, and not just 3 of them. It is probably a version of the myth or an edition by Snorri or other author, and they conceive them in the Prose Edda as being 3 main sisters, perhaps these 3 as goddesses, while the others, in a way, obey to these 3 main Norns. It is a possible interpretation, although I think that's a little bit of a stretch, given that the sources aren't really clear about this. I think we can really say that Norns would be female or feminine spirits associated with destiny and good and bad luck. Norns would dictate the events of humanity, at least that is what some poems and sagas suggest. However, because it is mythological material and even written long after the so-called Viking Age, after the end of the Iron Age in Scandinavia, and in fact, many sources are Icelandic and from a period of at least 200 years after Christianity became the official religion in the Nordic world. In terms of religious belief, it is not known exactly how the Norse, the ancient Norse, received or conceived the relationship with the Norns, as literature does not always express as reality. At certain times, the Norns were confused with the Valkyries as they dictated the final destination, whether the warriors would go to Valhall or not. Additionally, the name Skuld is also referred to as being the name of a Valkyrie. Many sources tell us about the Valkyries, the Fylgjur, as really weaving and manipulating destiny in a very macabre and totally gruesome way. So we keep on having the pattern of feminine spiritual entities linked to fate and destiny. That much is certain. Now, my dear friends, I do hope this video was useful. I hope you have enjoyed it, at the very least. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends. Finally.